Welcome to the Meru Media Podcast with Mukunda
Hi,
and
everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media Podcast. You're joining me, Mukunda and Krishna Parthasarathi today. We have an amazing guest today, something unique that we haven't done in, I think, our time doing interviews, which is really focusing on regional aspects of what I guess Hinduism, Buddhism, the Indic traditions play into. And today we have amazing guest today, Professor Archana Venkatesan, who is a professor of religious studies at UC Davis. And she has written quite a bit focusing really on the Tamil poetry of the, I guess, medieval era between the 6th and 10th century, primarily the Prabandams of the Azhwars. And she has, her most recent book, I think, is Endless Songs, I believe. And that is about Nammalvars or Shadagopin's Tiruvaimuri. And previously, she has written on Andal extensively, actually, covering both her Tirupave and Nachai Tirumuri. Professor Venkatesh, welcome to our program. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak to both of you and to have the opportunity to share some of this work with a broader audience. So thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to stimulating and fun conversation.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny because the first time I really heard about you was on the new books of Hindu Studies program with Raj Balkaran, and you've done a couple of interviews with him. And I was, to be honest, like I was blown away about the way you did your free interpretation, free verse of these amazing poetical works, right? Because quite often what you end up seeing is the previous translators would put it in the garb of their tradition, which is mostly the SriVaishnava tradition, and their commentarial position would, I mean, I'm not saying it added a lot of theological and metaphysical like gravity to it, but yours was very free flowing. And I love that the way that you can just read it without having necessarily the theological background or the traditional background when you approach these texts. So before we get into that, I really want to talk about that. Can you give us your background? Like, how did you get into this? Where did you start from? Where are you from originally? All that.
How long do you have?
We have all the time in the world. We have all the time in the world.
Well, it's a very both a somewhat, I think, not unusual story, but also in some ways slightly unusual. I grew up in Chennai, in what was Madras at that time. I did all of my schooling in Madras. Grew up as a typical, middle class kid going to an English medium school. Learned Hindi as a second language, was pursuing a science degree, like a science track towards a bachelor's degree, because that is what one did. Although I had no head for math and no head for physics. I loved chemistry, though. I really loved, mixing various chemicals and watching sort of the alchemy happen. But somewhere along the line, so I eventually decided that the sciences weren't for me, and I actually did a year of university in Chennai, studying English, which was really my passion. I love, from a very, very young age, loved poetry. My maternal grandfather was a very voracious reader, so from my earliest memories of him are listening to him recite Shakespeare and introducing me to sort of the canonical sort of English great white men works, Hamlet, and he had like all of Hamlet sort of memorized. So there were all of these, like always he had a perfect apt Shakespearean quote for any sort of situation. Like if you had to give you advice, he had like something from Shakespeare to sort of give you. So I sort of, that was my, so I sort of developed a very deep love of poetry, and that was something that that I kind of carried with me. And then I ended up coming to the US for my undergraduate education. Did my undergraduate degree in English Lit at Berkeley. And then again, just serendipitously, it was just one of these really strange coincidences that I had a roommate who was taking a class in Tamil literature. And she said, it's a graduate seminar, why don't you come? And I was like, I don't know any Tamil. Like at that point, I could barely read Tamil. I knew the letters.
Yeah.
I couldn't really read. I said, I don't know any Tamil. She said, no, don't worry. It's all in translation, which is a sort of, for me, now when I think back on it, a really transformational moment, because my life really has been, my scholarly life, my professional life has really been so devoted to sort of the practice, the art and craft of translation as a way to invite people into these other worlds and to also know these worlds that I encounter more intimately. So at that time, I had no clue. So I ended up going to this class, which was taught by Professor George Hart. And he was there in this very sort of dingy basement room. Krishna probably may or may not know this, because Dwinell has changed quite a bit. But at that time, the basement where the linguistics department was, it was quite a dingy place. It was this tiny little room, and he was sort of reciting these Tamil poems from the Ahananoru. Now, first, it was astonishing to me, right? This was really the first time I was hearing Tamil in a university context. Here was this professor,
white guy. Yes.
Yeah, just reciting these poems, but I couldn't understand it, right? I recognized the sound as Tamil, but they were completely unintelligible to me. So I remember I asked him very innocently, what is this? And he said, oh, this is Sangam poetry.
Wow.
I had never heard this. I said to him, what is Sangam poetry? And he looked like, what are you? How can you not know this?
You're Tamilian, how do you not know?
How do you not know? And you're from India and you don't know, you're from Tamil Nadu and you don't know Sangam poetry. And he wrote Sangam, Aham and Puram on the whiteboard. And then sort of gave me this crash course, or gave me, like the class, a crash course. And I just was like, I had no clue. Like nothing in my education had prepared me for this. And it was a kind of, I can't even describe what that was like. It was mind-blowing. So I went to the library and I checked out every book on Tamil literature that existed in the library and just read. And then I decided at that time that I had to learn Tamil so that I could read this in its original. And my first Tamil teacher was a MA student in the department who was an aspiring Tamil actor. He wanted to be a Tamil actor. And he was a wonderful teacher. He really was a very patient and had a very deep love of Tamil. He used to talk about Tamil as that she was like his wife. And just like any marriage, you had moments when you fought and moments when you made up, and it was a relationship that you nurtured. So that was really how I kind of got into Tamil. And I just sort of, I think, stumbled really into the world of the Azhwars, partly through the reading that I was doing. A.K. Ramanujan's Hymns for the Drowning was, of course, such a important work. And so I just was drawn to it. And this is the really funny thing, right? So I remember, as a child growing up in, Besanagar, Chennai, I would go for the Navaratri Golus, and there was always one Andal there. And I always thought Andal was just like a mythical figure, right? Like Parvati and Lakshmi. And so just imagine my shock and, some 20 years later, not quite 20, but 16, 17 years later, when I'm a student in a college, that I realized that Andal was actually a historical figure. And that was also the moment where I was kind of like, I want to figure out, how did this happen, right? How did she how did this poet become a goddess? And so I'd never read the Tirupavai. I had never heard of the Tirupavai. And let alone the Nachiyar Tirumuri, never heard of the Varanamayiram section of the poem. So it was a kind of real discovery for me of a kind of ocean of literature, but also I think a very profound journey of self-discovery as well, right? As a way of kind of being an immigrant in this country, sort of translation and poetry became both a way of making a place and a space for myself in this country that was now my home, but also a way to kind of keep connected to the country that I was born in and that I still had a very deep connection to and an affinity for. So that's sort of a kind of short version of this journey that I feel like was very accidental and serendipitous, but one of the, I would say, the thread that has, I think, animated all of this has really been my love of poetry. I feel for me that has been a kind of touchstone, a kind of way to make sense of myself, a way to make sense of the world, and a way to sort of, I think, cultivate a deep sort of sense of interiority as well, because poetry kind of forces you to do that. And translation, as I said, is this way of bridging worlds, and so this is where I am.
Wow, that's
beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing because it's something's really pounced out at me, because it's like you spend so much of your life in Tamil Nadu, and this is actually not just you. It's just I feel like almost every Tamilian I meet of between the ages of like 25 and like 50, they don't know Tamil. Like they can't read and write it. Like they can't,
because they probably went English medium schools.
Yeah, exactly. They went to English medium schools, and it's really fascinating to me that there's an entire generation in some ways that have lost touch with the physical language, in a way, because I mean a lot of Indians don't know, like even the Sanskrit script in many ways is based off Tamil Brahmi, right? It is a very it's so foundational to, I guess, all of India. It just I think people miss that when you're just there, and then you come to this country and suddenly you find yourself learning something that you would have never learned if you stayed in India, maybe.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it is quite an extraordinary. I mean, both that's why I said in some ways it's not at all an unusual story. As I said, I've heard the same story, like, oh, I didn't know anything about Tamil until I showed up in America at some university and I took Tamil. But at the same time, what is, I think, for me unusual is just sort of the very, very odd confluence of events that led me down this path. So it's I mean, again, it's also a kind of, at least when I was growing up, there is you struggle as a child in school, where to find and make a place for yourself. English is the language of mobility, upward mobility, as is Hindi. There's a kind of cool factor to speak in Hindi. There's a kind of cool factor. You're progressive, you're modern, but Tamil still has the sense of, Tamil la you're speaking, you're somehow backward. You're provincial. So it has these kinds of, so you are loath to sort of pursue Tamil, right? You're loath to kind of, I don't know if that's the case today, and I suspect that it may be quite different. But certainly when I was growing up, there was that the factor, you want to fit in, learning, being able to sort of speak English and, read the latest works, and sort of, there's a kind of fluency, a kind of social capital that comes from Hindi that Tamil simply doesn't have, at least in the worlds that I inhabited. And I suspect it was different. Class and caste have a huge part to play in this as well, in my own experience, which I don't think is emblematic or sort of is the norm. But I think certainly for the kind of experience that I had, the kind of schools I went to, there was really no space for Tamil, or for an engagement with Tamil in any kind of meaningful way, or indeed any kind of hint of the richness and the depth that exists and the range that exists in Tamil literature. Right. That was to me astonishing, really. I mean, when I was, as a student, if you had asked me to name 5 texts in Tamil, I would have not been able to.
Professor Venkatesan, you said something so beautiful. You said translation is a method of bridging worlds. That's such a beautiful statement. And poetry being about interiority. And I was just thinking about myself about the example of, the late Sri M.S. Subbulakshmi, Srimati M.S. Subbulakshmi. I think it was a very calculated decision for her not to just sing in South Indian dialects, but to also, sing in Bengali, sing Surdas bhajans, sing Tulsidas bhajans, to connect the whole musical world through language. And I just love what you're doing. And I was going to ask, is there something like Andal you see in other cultures in terms of bridging worlds? Is there a figure like Andal that you've seen in outside of India, or even maybe perhaps within India itself, like Mirabai?
Of course, there are so many poets like Sappho, for instance, whose poetry we have just in fragments, or Saint Teresa of Avila. There are so many wondrous, wonderful female poets, female writers. And even, of course, within India, Andal, or the poet Kodai is a remarkable figure. I mean, she really is, and her poetry is quite startling, and it's very, very beautiful. But one of the things I found, like having lived with Andal for so long, and I've sort of seen a kind of boom in interest around her. There's so many people sort of translating her works, writing sort of fiction about her, writing poetry in her voice. I read a really wonderful poem, sort of imagined by the Singaporean poet, in English, imagining Andal sort of talking to pigeons. It's just a remarkable. She does a kind of resurgence of interest, not to mention how many dancers, how many singers. I mean, every Margari, they're singing, Tripave. But at the same time, so there is this undoubtedly a kind of Andal boom. But I've also discovered, especially when I teach Andal in my classes, that she doesn't really translate very well to a non-South Indian, or perhaps if you push it, non-Indian audience, right? So that is not in, like, for instance, Lala, the great Kashmiri poet Lal Dev, or even the Veerashaiva poet Mahadevi Akka.
Yeah.
There's a kind of ability for their poetry to transcend the particularity of their social location and their historical context in a way that Andal doesn't. Students find it very difficult to connect to her because she's so embedded within a particular very specific South Indian landscape. You kind of have to really know the myths. You have to know the sort of landscape that she's in. You have to kind of know something of the sort of the animation of of Tamil Bhakti in order to really get into her. Whereas, figures like Mahadevi Akka or Laldev, there's a kind of transcendent quality, right? That it's in a way that students, especially undergraduate students that I find, respond very easily. They're able to kind of enter into their poetry. Perhaps it's their own sense of hesitation, right? Their own sense of like, oh, I don't know enough about this and I'm afraid to make a mistake. So I don't want to say X, Y, and Z. But there's a kind of like willingness to kind of enter into the poetry of these other female poets in a way that I found they struggle with a figure like with.
Sure. So let's take a step back, because I think, like, I want to get into Andal. I want to get into this conversation because I think it's very important. But a lot of people listening will have no sense of what Tamil literature is and where it stems from, right? People, most things when people think Tamil literature, they love to say Tirukkural, right? That one, the text, by so long ago. But that text is part of the earliest foundations of Tamil literature on the whole, whether it's Tolkappiyam or Tirukkural or Sangam or Puram literature. Can you kind of explain the origins of Tamil literature and then show a connection? Because I know there's a lot of motifs that play both in the Sangam literature and then that connect to in the Azhwar literature. But to understand that, you kind of have to understand the basic Tamil.
Okay, so I'll do. I mean, again, this is like grossly simplified.
Sure.
I'm not kind of. So one of the obviously very interesting things about Tamil literature is that it is one of the oldest continuous literary languages. So unlike, say, Sanskrit, which is not, people continue to write and compose in Sanskrit, but it doesn't quite have the same vibrancy. It's not a living language in the same sense that Tamil is.
Okay.
So Tamil has a continuous literary history, at least going back to the 1st century of the Common Era, which is when we see the first extant Tamil poetry, which we now refer to as the Sangam corpus, which broadly is categorized into the Aham poetry, which is the poetry of the interior. This is love poetry, and the poetry of Puram, which is the external, the poetry of exteriority. So it concerns everything that is public, like kings and ethics and law and war and all of this. So they are not opposites, but complements, and they sort of are interpenetrating of each other. One of the distinguishing features of Aham poetry is that it always features characters who are archetypes. So there are no named characters. And so there's the sense that there's a kind of universalizing sort of hero and heroine whose love affair you are sort of following. Yet at the same time, you are also sort of distanced from that experience because they are archetypes. You're always understanding that you are reading something that is placed within a frame that is far away from you. Puram, on the other hand, always has named characters, or often will have named characters, a named poet. The poet will place themselves within the poem. The king may be named. So that frame, that frame is sort of broken, right? So there is obviously, you don't have, our tendency is often to kind of just draw a kind of linear X, Y, Z. But that is not how history functions. That's not how literature develops. So it's not that we go from Sangam directly to the Bhakti tradition. There's all kinds of other things happening, but Bhakti sort of poetry, or this explosion of this particular kind of movement, this particular sort of relationship to God, this particular attitude, this ideology sort of uses poetry very effectively, right? And that makes sense because poetry is such a powerful, and has been in the Tamil-speaking South, a very powerful medium. So of course, it makes sense that this new sort of ideology uses poetry to sort of make its case. But what it also does is it, in that process, creates a new sort of literary genre, what we today refer to as Bhakti poetry. They are not talking about it in that sense, but it is a sort of new Bhakti, it's new genre that develops, that merges certain elements of Aham and Puram together. So for instance, the poet taking from the Puram elements, it places the poet within the poem, so that that barrier is sort of becomes very permeable, very porous. The frames that are so important in the earlier literary traditions become much more unstable. The distance between the poet and the audience, between the poet and the speaker of the poem, also is unstable. And also, and then you kind of get these these notions of the sort of the singing of particular sacred spaces and sacred places, sort of the praising of God in terms of as a hero. So very often in Puram poems, a king will be praised by talking of us, giving this genealogy of all of his great deeds, and that gets adapted into the Bhakti form, where the great deeds are all of these like in the case of Shiva, his 8 great acts, or in the case of Vishnu, his avatars, and so on and so forth. So there's this very sort of very radical, very innovative reimagining of and a sort of and a kind of appropriation and a kind of retooling of this past to create this very different new literary genre that is that definitely is has a kind of oral quality to it. It's meant to be kind of meant to be sung. It's meant to be performed. Performance is often very key to these poems. They often refer within the poems themselves about performance. Singing, dancing is often there's a very famous very beautiful Nammalvar verse from the second 100, Adi Adi Aham Karainde. It's spoken in the voice of the female voice, where the woman is saying, the mother saying, oh, look at her, she's just singing, her aham, her interior is just melting away as she dances. And she she just sings, and she calls out Narasingha. And in this way, she just melts away. She just dissolves this seeking Narasingha. So even in this poem, you see how important the performance, singing and dancing are. So in Bhakti poetry, you see all of these, you sort of see the emergence of these large cycles, like, like in the Thiruvaimuri, you have a very complex structure where you have a 10, which is set within 100, which is set within the 1,000, or even in the Nachiyar Tirumuri, which has 14 sections in distinct. These are all sort of innovations that emerge. Now, of course, then you have, you have this emerging, and then you have other kinds of literary genres that emerge in the post Bhakti period, and that continue on. But the stamp of Bhakti and the kinds of innovations that we see are pretty radical and quite astonishing. And it's lucky. And one of the sad things is we don't know, like, how many poets were there, like how many poets did we lose, how many poets whose poems did not make it. So we have probably a small fragment of what was actually composed. So that is also one of the tragedies, or perhaps one of the ways in which we think about of the way in which literature is sort of conceived. There's always at the center of these poems and of these traditions a sense of loss, right? That even the Divya Prabandam is lost multiple times and has to be reconstructed. Not to mention the Devaram, which is lost and only partially retrieved. So the heart of these, the traditions themselves reflect on that sense that what you have is very fragile. That's something, it can just go like that, right? And it is up to us about, and how do you then preserve it? How does poetry survive? Who's the caretaker of it?
It gets formalized, right? Into like something like, Margari Masam, where everyone sings it, and it lives on through to some sort of ritualization in some sense, right?
Yes. So, that comes much later.
Yeah.
But those are some of the ways in which you do see sort of seek to preserve a living tradition.
Do you know how it gets? You know how it lives? It lives because people love it so much. If you love this stuff so much, you don't wait for an institution. You just do it in your daily ritual at home. And then through the individual family, it's just through love. If you truly love this stuff, you don't wait for an institution. You're just going to do it at home.
Well, in some ways that is true. If you love it, you preserve it. But there is there's a sort of, we as a tradition, like the story is full of, like our history is full of what gets preserved, right? What is important? Only those things that are important get preserved, that get remembered. So it's not just about love, it's about who loves it and who thinks it's important enough to preserve it. For instance, there's all of the stories of Uwe Saminadeyar and how he kind of was responsible for kind of reinventing and rediscovering Sangam literature, which really did not exist. I mean, it existed within communities of like Jains and certain other kinds of communities who were, Adinams and so forth, where they were kind of remembering and preserving like texts like the Silappatikaram and the Jivaka Santamani. But Uve Saminadayar, who had a very traditional education, Tamil education, learned all of the canonical like Tirumurais and Tiruvasakams and all of these kinds of texts, did not encounter the Jivaka Santamani. He did not encounter the Silappatikaram. He did not hear the Purananura, Hananura, right? So he had to go and recover these texts. But there were communities that had remembered them, that were preserving them, that there were manuscripts. So it's a question of power. It's a question of who has access, who deems them important. So yes, love is important.
Yeah, the tides
love
of history.
is important, but love is not enough. It matters who is doing the preserving.
Yeah, like you said, aham and puram, right? There needs to be some more puram, like some public responsibility with that. These, like, we can be doing all our own aham inside, but there's a public mandate, loka samgraha, this type of idea.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have that, and it's also a question. I mean, there's a double-edged sword, right? So when you have it, when you have texts like, say, the Divya Prabandam that get preserved, and luckily for us, they get preserved, and at least we have what we have.
Yeah.
The text is almost certainly incomplete because we know, for instance, we have texts that have 87 verses, or like the Periya Tirumuri is 1084 verses, and it's like just stops in the middle. And like, what happened? So that there must have been more, but this is all we have. Or even the Nachiyar Tirumuri itself is almost, at least in my opinion, almost certainly an incomplete work. But what happens when you do get it preserved? It also means that it means now the access is cut off, right? So that means there's only certain people who have access to it. Until the 20th century, until print culture allowed you to start printing these texts and people could buy them and read them, there's very small people like me, who woman would not have had access to reading the Thiruvaimuri on my own. Or the reading the commentaries on my own. Even very recently, I was, when I was there, I was told, you can't read them. You're a woman. You cannot recite the Thiruvaimuri. You're a woman.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Professor Venkatesh, but I've even dealt with close family members of mine who are female, and they say the same thing. These were mostly, they say, the scriptures were texts written by men for men. And they just ignore them all. And that's why Andal is so awesome for me, Mirabai and all that. So, but yeah, maybe you've dealt with this kind of attitude too. And sorry to interrupt you, but just to...
No, that's true. So I'm saying that, yes, you can have public, but, the moment you kind of bring that, it also becomes institutionalized. That means it's controlled. You're controlling who has access to it, who's reading it, who can encounter it, who can interpret it. And so, that means that a whole lot of people are suddenly no longer able to access this. And I think, one of the things that I often think about is this I don't know if you know the story of the Divya Prabandam has very interesting, like or the origin of the SriVaishnava tradition is something I find quite fascinating. There's a number of origin stories, right? So you have the origin story of the first Mudallarvar. In Tirukovilur, they have that encounter, which is sort of a kind of origin moment for the SriVaishnava tradition. But then you have the other moment, which is of Nathamuni encountering the wandering singers who are singing the Thiruvaimuri. And they only sing 10 verses. And at the end, every Falashruti of every 10 verses of the Thiruvaimuri will say that this is 10 verses out of 1,000. So Nadamuni hears this and says, wow, these are such incredible verses. So where are the other 990 verses? And the singer says, oh, we don't know. We only know this much. And so Nadamuni says, oh, okay. And he goes on like a little detective, and finds various people who tell him, go here, go there. And then finally finds someone who's a student of Madhura Kavi who says, listen, recite this composition of Madhura Kavi, which is the Kannin Chiratamba, and recite it X number of times, and then you will get Nammalvar and he'll. So he does this, and then Nammalvar shows up and says, reveals the Tiruvaimuri to him. And then he's so pleased with him. He says, okay, you didn't even know that there was this 3,000 other verses. I'm going to reveal the 3,000 other verses. So this is sort of this, but there's of course the first revelation. And then after this, Narada Muni says, oh, this cannot get lost. So I'm going to institutionalize it. And this is supposed to be one of the origins of the Arayar Sevai. So he teaches the recitation of the Tiruvaimuri and the Divya Prabandam to his two nephews, Melakhattalvar and Kirhattalvar. And sort of it becomes institutionalized in the temple in Srirangam. So the story is in some ways embedding this transformation of poetry that's in the streets, being sung by people who are itinerant musicians, probably not Brahmins, being taken by a Brahmin man and institutionalized, controlled, and placed within a temple context. And once that happens, then who has access to the text is immediately also limited. Now, this is in contrast to what happens in the origin of the Tiruvaimuri itself, where according to the Nammalvars, like the hagiography, Madhurakavi follows the light, to Alvar Tirunagari, and this boy who has been sitting under this tree for 16 long years, silent, just sort of breaks into song when he encounters Madhurakavi. There's a kind of exchange that happens, and just pours out the Tiruvaimuri. So this is like an exactly opposite, right? And of course, the caste relationship is also reversed, and the age relationship, because Madhurakavi is the Brahmin, and Nammalvar is not, he's a Velala, or supposedly a Velala. We don't know his caste identity because he doesn't mention it in the poems. He only tells us, we only know that he uses the title Maran, which we know was associated with Pandya kings. So he had some kind of a relationship with the Pandya kings. But we don't know what his caste identity is. He never mentions it. So, but we know, but he's also much younger than, in the story at least, much younger than Madhurakavi. So there's a kind of inversion in the story. But then you have this kind of, that inversion is kind of reinverted in the recovery narrative, so that, you get this institutionalizing of the tradition that continues then for another, through commentaries and so forth, for another 800, 900 years until the 20th century, when things really begin to change, when, we have print, and print changes everything, because now anybody can buy a book and read it.
And YouTube changes it even more too.
Yes, YouTube changes it even more.
YouTube will have Andal resurgence.
It went from written word back to spoken word again.
Hey, full cycle. We've done it.
That's right.
Exactly.
No, but it's very interesting how these, we have so many different versions of these stories, right? And the way we talk about their origins and their resurgence and losing them and gaining them. It's just like this cycle of us grappling with wanting to maintain something that, that if it remains on its own will probably just disappear at some level. And then you have to control it, like you're saying. But the moment you control it, you control who has access to it, you have control of. But then there's so many different traditions, even within the SriVaishnava tradition, whether you're Tengale or Vadagale, it changes how you view who can chant it. Like, the Tengales are much more open to women chanting it and having, Vadagales are, but the Tengales are tend to be much more like egalitarian in some of their views for Pile Lokacharya and stuff like that. Like they're separate commentary. So you have so much diversity there, but it's complex.
It is very complex. It is very complex.
So getting back to your kind of work. So can we talk about first, who are the Azhwars? We kind of went through them, but who are they and what do they represent to the history of this literature?
Okay, so the Azhwars, we know, probably lived between the 6th and the 9th century, and the word Azhwar means those who are immersed or those who are drowning, sort of evocative of this very immersive experience of God.
Right.
It probably changed. There's a theory that a few Tamil scholars have posited that it actually initially meant Alvar, the retroflex L, meaning those who rule, and that somehow that changed into Alvar, those who are immersed. If they are called the Azhwar, that means those who rule, they would parallel the title that you get for the Nayanmar, who are the leaders. And there's a theory that that's why Andal alone retains that she who rules in her title. So there's a theory that that might be one of the reasons that that it probably was Azhwar, those who rule, that became Azhwar, those who are immersed. So they are today, we have them, they're 12 poets, and they probably lived between the 6th and the 9th century, primarily in the south, in the southern part of the subcontinent, in what today we know as Tamil Nadu, primarily Tamil Nadu. They are, we don't know very much historically about them. In fact, about the, we know the names of very few of them, like Kulashekaran, Thirumangai, Chattakoppam, Kodai, Vishnu Chittam. Some of them we have their names. Some of them we just have these like Poihe, Pe, Budam, Thirupanalvar, they're Thirumarsha Alvar, they're sort of, they're Poike Pe Budam, just abstract sort of disembodied names. So we don't know, and they don't give us in their poems anything historical about themselves. So so the hagiography, we get the hagiographies that come much later. So we don't know whether Poike Pe and Budam were 3 poets. Were they just the same poet who wrote 3 poems? We don't, so there's a lot of sort of unknown. So that, our job, the tradition regards them as 12 poets.
Yeah.
But we don't know. His scholarship, we cannot say, right? Is the first 3 Azhwars were their first 3, or is it just one poet writing 3 different poems? So there are, like, for instance, Thirumangai Alvar's Madal poems, for instance, don't have a signature. So were they composed by Thirumangai Alvar, they attributed to him, or were they composed by a poet? We do not know, right? So there are all kinds of questions about these poets, and indeed there's lots of questions about their dating as well.
Sure.
So Thirumangai Alvar is sometimes dated to the 8th century because of a verse in the Periya Tirumuri where he praises the temple site in Kanchipuram, the Vaikuntha Perumal temple, which he refers to as the Parameshwara Vinnagaram. In this section, he names the Pallava king who built that temple by name. And so there's this scholarship is sort of, scholars have said, he must have known this Pallava king, and therefore he is dated to his period. But at the same time, there are other pieces of evidence within the poetry of Thirumangai Alvar, which would demand that we place him much later, because the early Alvar poets, for instance, are not as concerned with sacred places and mapping of sacred places in the same way that you see in the later tradition. So Thirumangai Alvar is obsessed and very systematic in the Periya Tirumuri about mapping places. He's of all the Alvars, he's the one who sings the most about pilgrimage sites. So that, for instance, is a clue that perhaps he's later than the earlier Alvars. So to go back to the original question, is that, so the Alvars are these 12 poets who are historical figures, or perhaps historical figures, who composed poems in this new genre of Bhakti poetry in praise of Vishnu. They compose in a number of different registers. So there are poems that are purely sort of philosophical and very esoteric. There are poems that are composed in the voice of the woman, like male poets adopting the female voice. There are poems that are, like, as I said, with Thirumangai Alvar, very systematic description and praise of pilgrimage sites, praises of particular avatars, and of course quite unusual and innovative kind of decisions. For instance, the wonderful poet Kulashekara Alvar, who composed the Perumal Tirumuri, has 2 very unusual decades in the Perumal Tirumuri. One in which is a lament of Devaki, who is imagining what it would be like to have raised Krishna as her child. So she imagines all the things that Yashoda would be doing to Krishna, but ends by saying, but I don't have this opportunity. It's just a heartbreaking and such a beautiful sort of description of maternal love and loss. Similarly, in that same Perumal Tirumuri, just a couple of decades later, he has a very unusual lament of Dashratha, just as Rama is leaving for the forest. So these kinds of innovations that you see, this kind of reimagining is also very typical of the Azhwar. So there's a kind of range, emotional range, a kind of imaginative range as well in how they are kind of calibrating, describing, and exploring their relationship with this deity who is mercurial, who is transcendent, who is unknowable, but yet is intimate, is your friend, is your lover, who is this Paranjyoti, but is at the same time this little child.
Yeah.
So it's
So
it's a kind of, and one of the, I think one of the things that for me has been so inspiring really, and for me as a translator and somebody who loves poetry, is just the remarkable quality of the poetry of the Divya Prabandam. It's, I mean, the range of it. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's just really, really extraordinary to me that, you know, you read, sometimes I read like a Poiga Azhwar and I say, oh, the madri yaru ezhudhirukka mudiyadhu. Nobody could write like it. And then you read a Tirumangai Azhwar and you think, what karpane, what imagination.
So I have a question as to this, Professor. So, I mean, in many ways, when I also read, you get this feeling of, it almost feels spontaneous, as if like it's just coming out of them in that moment. But also it does feel very, parts of it seem very, I hate the word manufactured, but like thought through, right? Like, yes. like they, like, you know, in Tivaimori, even like just that thought process of being able to connect all the words for him, her, it, just putting that together, it seems so, I don't know how, I mean, like they sat down to, I don't know if I'm able to convey what I'm trying to say.
I understand what you mean. So, you know, my very favorite poet, John Keats, had this wonderful, in a letter he says, poetry should come like leaves on a tree or should not come at all.
Did he do Ode on a Grecian urn? Is that Ode on?
Yes, Ode on a Grecian urn. But what he means is that poetry should, it's not that he means that poetry should just come spontaneously, that poetry should just come like, you know, all of us know that a tree is working very hard to put those leaves out in the spring. It's not just a magic thing, but it appears like it's magic. So think about a ballet dancer who soars through the air and it looks utterly effortless.
Sure.
And part of the illusion is that it looks effortless, except the ballet dancer knows the effort that it took for her to fly, or him to fly, the muscles that it took, the training that it took. So think about these poems in much the same way, that they give you the illusion that they are spontaneous. They give you the illusion that they just emerge like that. But behind it, it's like a duck, you know, moving along very smoothly on the top, but paddling furiously below. It's like that because there is no question that the Tiruvaimuri, 1102 verses in Andadi, with all of this very careful, very complex homonyms, wordplay, there's no way that somebody composed 1102 verses without thought.
Yeah.
Right? And there are also 1102 verses that have a structure. Each 11 verses are about a particular theme, you know, and so there is a kind of structure that the text has that, yes, we have given the impression that these are spontaneous. And of course, the tradition itself encourages us to think that way, right? The story says that Nammalvar just like opens his mouth and Tiruvaimuri just comes out. But anybody who has written poetry, even bad poetry, knows that it takes effort, right? The rapper I'm always astonished when I hear spoken word poets or rappers.
amazing,
It's
Yeah.
like, how do their words just
Right.
come out like
amazing.
that? But it doesn't mean that there hasn't been practice, that there hasn't been effort, that they
I
haven't
know.
been thinking about it, right? So the illusion is of ease.
I love it. The illusion of spontaneity. I
So,
love it.
I
It's a
mean-
beautiful quotation. Hashtag illusion of spontaneity.
But it's also, I mean, I guess it plays on the word of calling Krishna Mayan also. It's the illusion, it's the creative power, the nature of Brahman in that context where, I mean, but also, I mean, the poetry, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of work going to it, but there's like this bhava, this rasa that just kind of, this just permeates it, where it does feel like they're in that beautiful state or despondent state or whatever state that they're writing in. They're in that state because it feels again.
Yes, again, I think that's what great poetry does, right? Any great poet. I don't mean just Azhwar. You take Robert Haas, one of the great American poets, or Gary Snyder, a great American poet, or John Keats. You take any great poet, the ability to capture what you feel in a particular moment and put it into words and make you, the reader, feel that you are experiencing what they experienced in that moment.
Anubhava, right? Yeah, Anubhava, right? This
yes, that is that idea of Anubhava that is so crucial as an interpretive sort of technique for the SriVaishnavas. That, again, that's what great poetry does, right?
Yeah.
That is not to say that the feeling is not real, that the experience is not real, but poetry is a way into, it's a window into this, right? In some ways, poetry is itself a process of translation, because you are translating this expansive experience that you've just had, whatever it may be, whether it's hearing the song of the nightingale, or whether it's watching the daffodils on the valley, or you're hearing some kind of you're having some kind of mystical experience like Nammalvar. The ability to hold on to that feeling and somehow capture it, because one of the things about poetry is also it's a medium of economy, right?
What do you mean by that? Can you explain?
It means that it's
brief, right?
You have to say a lot with very few words.
Yeah, it's brief.
Yeah?
Professor Venkatesan, I got to ask you, I know you're a professor, one who professors and you give lectures in the university environment to undergrads and graduate students. Do you ever feel that to express your love for poetry, you yourself need to write poetry? Rather than giving these lectures, like I'm saying, like maybe you need to use the poetry to express your love for poetry. Does that sound
that's why I'm a translator. Because I'm a failed poet.
Oh no, nothing like that. I'm feeling your love right now. Nothing like that. I'm getting your appreciation of the art, and it's going to make me dive into these poets even more. So you're doing a good job, just so you know.
I've always aspired, or no, I don't say I want to say always, because that's now a dead dream.
No, you're still young.
But as an undergrad, as a lover of poetry, I did want to be a poet, and I did write poetry, and very bad poetry. But translation is a way in, right? It is a way. You're like a ventriloquist. You're not right. You're not using your own. You're sort of using the poetry of another person to make your own poems, right?
Well, I will say this, Professor. Like reading your verse poetry, your free verse poetry, is you coming out in that poetry. I think it's like you're merging with the author of that poetry to convey that poetry into the poetry that we can read. Right,
bridging.
Bridging in some sense, because I've read other translations of the Ramuri or whatever, and they're very laden with a lot of difficult reading, where it doesn't feel like poetry anymore. It feels much more like you're writing the Old Testament Bible, like ye or this, or it's not very free flowing, and I appreciate that about your translations. I think is
well. Thank you. I mean, for me, the poetry has always been the at the forefront. It's always been very important to me as a translator.
Yeah,
for the poetry to shine through. This is not to mitigate or to lessen the theology and the philosophical and sort of the Sampradaic sort of context of these poems. But the reason that the Thiruvaimuri or a text like the Thiruvaimuri survives is because it's great poetry.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, it's important that be preserved, that poetic quality be preserved. And one of the remarkable things about Nammalvar as a poet is that he's a very simple poet. And by that, I mean that his language is quite simple. Unlike, say, a poet like Kamban, who's quite Baroque, it's very ornamented, the language. Nammalvar is a very economical poet. He says a lot with very few words, which means that there's a lot of ambiguity in how he uses. There's a lot of sort of grammatical ambiguity. Sometimes you don't know precisely what the subject and the object are, or what the relationship is, or who the subject is, or who's doing what to what, right? And that's deliberate. And you as a translator, and I've always say this, translation is not explanation. Your job as a translator is to not explain the poem, right? You have to let the ambiguities inherent in the poem to exist. So if the verse is unclear or deliberately unclear, then you have to retain that. And so one of the things I tried very hard to do in this translation was to strive for that economy. That's why I say that poetry is a medium of economy, right? It's not like prose where you can have all kinds of things that explain. Poetry require you just have to say so little. You have to say so much in so few words, right? You have to so that means you break the rules of grammar a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You do kinds of funny little things. You reverse the order of things. So when you rely on images and metaphors to do a lot of your work for you, that requires the reader therefore also to do a lot of work. So for me as a translator, for me, my aspiration is always to make the reader work hard, right? So the Thiruvaimuri is not an easy text for somebody who knows Tamil. This is why you have so many commentaries on the Thiruvaimuri. They're still writing commentaries on the Thiruvaimuri, trying to explain what the Thiruvaimuri is. People as great as Periyavachan Pillai and Pillan, they were writing commentaries to explicate the Thiruvaimuri because it was a difficult text. It is an important text. So they too have doubts. So why do you assume that, and they worked hard to understand the text. So why do we have to assume that if we're translating the text into English, we have to understand everything right away?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I guess my follow-up to this question is, so since we're on the topic of poetry particularly, and we'll go back to the Azhwars in a minute, but I think this is kind of interesting to me. Sanskrit poetry, the Kavya literature is very bounded, right, by the language of Sanskritam and the way that you have to do poetry. So, yeah, I mean, much after Kalidasa, you don't find that much greatness in the type of poetry that you used to see between the time of the Gupta region, of the Gupta period. But was Tamil poetry in similar ways bound by grammatical considerations, or was it much more free?
Of course, it's bound by grammatical considerations. Of course, the rules of meter and form, and rhythm, and rhyme, all of these are at play. But what is that a great poet makes those constraints work for them, right? And like the verse that you were citing, Nam Avan Ivan Uvan, right? That's just a recitation of paradigms. That's just the Tamil paradigms. But he does it in a way that is so, just the rhythm of it is itself, again, remember here, there's no markers in that. There's no markers, there's nothing. It's just a recitation. That's the only thing you get at the end to mark the what is actually happening, the sort of action of the poem. Or even in the very famous second decade, Vidumin Mutravum Vidu Seidum. It's just a play on the word Vidu, to let go. Vidu Dayan, Vidu Seidum. Vidu. That's it. And if you just literally translate it, it's like let go, letting go, let go of the person who is the person who is letting go. Literally, that's what it is. But that is
Lost in translation. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So that is the greatness of a poet who is able to work within the constraints, but uses the full resources of the language, right? The wealth of meaning that a word like Vida has.
Now, did this require that these Alvars were literate, or was it, or did it not require literacy but oral literacy? I mean, if you understand what I'm saying there.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know. That's a difficult question to answer because the idea of writing, right?
Yeah.
They were. Let me put it this way: they were at least a figure like Namarvar or Tirumangai, Andal, definitely very, very erudite, very well educated, clearly aware of the Sanskrit as well as Tamil sources. There are some verses in Namarvar that are very clearly, there is a very famous verse in the Thiruvirutham where he's very aware of the Sangam typology, like of the 5 landscapes.
Yeah.
And there's a famous verse in the Nachar Tirumuri where it's a clear allusion to a Kurunduhai verse. So they were clearly aware of their literary past. They were playing with it, and they are aware of ritual. They're aware. They're theologically very, very complex, so there's no question they were very erudite. They were very learned. Whether they were writing, whether they read, it's hard to know, because orality has always been that's why all of these stories tell us not about writing, but of reciting and hearing.
Right. So, which is why, I mean, jumping into someone like Andal, right, in particular, the level of erudition she has is pretty deep and wide, to be honest. Like like the way she talks about Sanskrit literature, in many ways, her allusions are to esoteric concepts within the Mahabharata, within the Vishnu Purana. Like when I read it, I'm like, oh, she's referring to this, and this only occurs in this particular. What does that tell about the way she was educated? And do you know the historical basis? Were women educated at that time? Were they not? Do we have any sense of how unique or not unique she was in that world? Because she's supposed to be a young child, right? 16 to 20 or something.
Yes, so we don't know. We don't know really anything about her. Historically, we don't know anything about Kodai. We just can ascertain that she was a very, very, very well educated woman. That she was, I don't know. There's this idea that she was a young girl, young woman. For me,
maybe that's wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hagiography, right? That's the legend that's come down to us. I think part of it is because it's a way to kind of, I think, mute the erotic elements of the Nachar Tirumuri.
Wow.
Somehow makes it more palatable if she's just a very young virginal girl. But for me, I personally, I find it very difficult to imagine this as being produced by a young person. I think this is a person of some experience, of some experience of ritual, of training in terms of theology, in terms of Tamil poetry. So I don't know that she was maybe not her 40s or 50s, but I think she may have been in her 20s. Her voice is very mature to me.
Yeah.
And the fact that she is able to switch registers, right? So there are verses like that she makes room in her poetry for that younger voice, like in the Tirupavai, which is these gopi girls who are speaking in this very young and very youthful, very earnest voice. Or you see in the Nachar Tirumuri and say the Kudi to Kudale or the Sitral Sirel sections, which is a very young, like a young teenage voice. But compare that to something like Karpuram Narumo, which is, or Vinnila Mela Pavirital Por Me Hankal, or Kandanyannum Karandevam, any of those later verses, or Tamu Happum Taim Tamkayil, that is a very different voice. That is a voice of maturity, of depth, that has a completely different register than
Yeah.
these voices of that you see of the young girls that you hear in the Tirupavai and you hear in some sections of the Nachiyar Tirumuri. So that in itself for me is a clue that the fact that she's able to manipulate those voices suggests and adopt these different personae suggests to me that she is somebody who is aware of the possibilities and is probably somebody who's older, who has that experience, who is capable of that kind of depth and richness of feeling. The ways in which she talks about sexual desire, for instance, it's hard to imagine a 12 or 13-year-old girl talking about it, even accounting for the fact that in the period that she was talking of, lived 12 and 13, would have been a marriageable age, right? Soon after puberty. Even given that, the way she talks about sexual desire, longing, is of a much more, it's not the sort of that first flush of, it's a mature desire. It's a desire that has really sort of blossomed and is sort of rich and sort of has a kind of depth to it that is not just like hormones raging when you're 12 and 13, right?
Yeah.
So
just on a side note, one of the things probably someone else has noticed this is I find so much of the way that Andal talks about desire for Krishna connected to how like Jayadeva talks about when he writes in the Gita Govinda. There is even the physical description of the breasts or hips or things of that nature where she feels the longing for Krishna. It's so emulated by Jayadeva, it's weird because how we as a society now, or even within the Tamil, we kind of, that sexuality is kind of put away and seen like as if like it's just metaphor, when not like the way you're feeling as a woman or as putting yourself in that situation. It's almost taboo to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that to be kind of very terrible, to lose that emotive element that that Andal had really felt in her being. And why are we just making it simply to be a supernatural thing, as opposed to this is aching, this it's important, we all feel it.
And it's a really I think that's one of the things that's quite distinctive about her, as say opposed to say Nammalvar or Thirumangai or even Kulashekara Alvar, who use the female voice. They have to rely on a kind of formula, right? Because they're men writing as women. There's a kind of directness to the way she talks about her body, the way she talks about that experience, which and her experience is like so somatic and so corporeal, like it's really like of the body and in the body. That is that's quite, I think that's quite unusual, at least within the Alvar corpus. And you see this very often with, not that Nammalvar and Thirumangai do not speak directly in the female voice, they do, there are a number of verses where, but very often you'll have other people reporting on how they are doing. Like you'll have a mother or you'll have a friend or somebody speaking about the way in which the woman is, right? Rather than a direct, it's not that you don't have those, you definitely have those direct, like in the Thurukurungudi Pasaram for verses, but there is some, really remarkable, something quite distinctive about Kodai. That's why I think she speaks to so many women today, especially people who are dancers, and that there's a kind of way that she allows you to use her voice to kind of speak of your own desires in a way that is, I think that a lot of women find very empowering.
Professor Venkatesan, can you talk a little bit more about that concept of like, what is it like to be a female bhakta versus a male bhakta? I'm really fascinated by this concept of these male Azhwars adopting the female voice, whether superficially or like, but not fully as somatic, like you said with Andal. But is there an example of a female Azhwar who adopts a male voice to express bhakti in a different way?
I mean, the females have a very interesting thing to say, right, about this. They say in the Andal, in the Guru Parampara Prabhavam, one of the early hagiographies of the Azhwars and the Acharyas. In the Andal story, they say that Andal's desire for Vishnu is easy because she's a woman, and it flows down like water from the top of a hill down. Whereas the male Azhwars, it is, an upward trajectory because they have to make the switch.
Wow.
But there's another text called the Acharya Hridayam, which is a text about the Tirvanari, in which the Aragya Manavala Perumal Nayanar, the author of the text, says that he's in these very short sutras where he says that Nammalvar when he speaks in union, he speaks in his own voice. But when he speaks in separation, it's always in the female voice, right? So there is this kind of idea that when there is union, and when it is love, that love, the animating principle of love is separation, right? Wow. That you can't have love if you don't have separation. You have to have that, and the female voice is best suited to this. Now, I think that obviously
as a male, I'm offended. I'm offended as a male. Just kidding.
But also, I think, from a feminist perspective, that's a sort of, it's very problematic, right? To sort of place
the glorification of the fact, like, you guys can love more than we do. Well, we love too, okay.
But the more problematic being that the woman is always the one who is left behind, the idea that you, as a woman, you have to, there's a kind of passivity, right? The god is male and goes away, and you have to sort of wait in this place. It's deeply problematic, right? So there is a kind of assumption of heteronormative sexuality and desire and all of these things that for us in the 21st century, reading back retrospectively, I mean, that are problematic. But within the framework of the text, and within, this is where we have to be careful, right? What is the tradition itself doing? What is the poet doing?
Right.
What does the tradition then do with the poet? And then what do we as 21st century readers who have inherited all of this stuff, that has allowed us to become attentive to inequalities and oppressions and the sort of lack of voice of so many communities. What is that? And how do we then sort of navigate that? And I think that is very hard to do, right? Because you have to take the texts on their own terms, because they are composed at a particular moment in history, and they are composed in a particular social context by people in particular social locations, which are then, as I said, institutionalized in very specific ways. But that doesn't mean we cannot raise these questions about them and grapple with them. The hard thing to do is when you sort of like say, oh, Ivarla Azhwar, these are the Azhwars, and we cannot question them.
Yeah.
We cannot, you cannot touch it, right? So there was this a few years ago, there was a writer who wrote a short story about Andal in this series, a Tamil writer called Nonbu, and in which he sort of imagines Andal as a Devadasi, and it's a sort of a Marxist reading of the Andal story.
Sure.
And of course, this was assigned to a syllabus in some college, and somebody found out, and there was a big hue and cry, because like, how can you say this about Andal? She's a goddess, Nambataya Rapati Prishallalama, and so on and so forth. Now, that's the problem, as I said, when we began the conversation, that when you preserve these texts and they become institutionalized, then they also close off the interpretive possibilities. Like now, Kodai, nobody refers to her. She doesn't call herself Andal in the poems.
Kodai, yeah.
She's Kodai. So there is the identity of the poet Kodai and the goddess Andal have become so fused that, and in fact, to the degree that Kodai has ceased to exist and you only see Andal.
Yeah,
that's a disservice to the poet, right? So you could be, as I think, modern, contemporary, if you're really truly interested in this tradition, right? I think there's a way to hold both together. You can respect this, who she is to communities and devotees everywhere. I mean, I've spent years at the Srivilliputturu Andal temple.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful temple with such beautiful rituals and beautiful anubhavas of Andal. But you can hold that on one hand, and you can also hold at the same time, or try to recover, or at least encounter the poet Kodai on her own terms. Right? But if you can only encounter her through this lens of the goddess Andal, with this hagiography, then you cannot hear who she is. And you have then closed her off. And it's a terrible disservice to this poet, because it means that you have limited the range of possibilities. You have limited how she speaks to you.
Sure.
What she can mean.
Hey, let me say one thing. Sorry to interrupt. You're going to laugh at this, Professor Venkatesan. I was at my Pariyapa's house the other day, and he had this book. It said Godanjali. I was like, what is this book? I've never heard of Godanjali. So I pick up the Godanjali, and I realized this Tirupalai. And I didn't even know it was called Godanjali. I didn't even know her name was Kodai. I only just thought of her as Andal the whole time. So this is just to reiterate your point. We forgot Kodai, and most of us only remember Andal, but it's important to remember Kodai's voice, Koda's voice. Sabash, kya baat hai. Very good. I didn't even know Godanjali was Tirupalai. So stupid I am.
I have that book, red book.
This is a red book. Yeah.
With a peacock feather.
Yes, written by, I think, Subhadra. Someone.
Yes, I have that book.
It's so good. It's so good. I was going through the first 5 Pasurams today, and the one story about Nanda and how when he was any ants that came in his way when he was carrying Krishna back, he would stab them with a spear.
Yes.
And the question is like, why does he need a spear to stab ants? And it's just beautiful. Like, he's just going to be furious to protect his son.
Yes.
So beautiful. See, love of a father.
No, but I mean, a point that, it's interesting. It's that you bring up like these, you put yourself into positions of whether lover, friend, or father or mother, but for a large part, like you're indicating, it seems much more like any sort of bhakti connection is overly women-centric. So overly, you're going to be either a mother, like viewing Yashoda or Devaki or Kausalya, and then once in a while you get Dasharatha. You get Dasharatha thrown in, but it's always like gopis, or it's just always this connection. And one of the things I think about is when it comes to Shaktas, right? Like how they don't have the same. You can't. How is that connection done, right? Like, and do we have any in any of the works of the Azhwars anything towards Sri, or is it all only towards Vishnu?
I mean, there is in Tirupave, right? That the 18 in verse 18 and 19, Undumada Kalitran, which was supposed to be Ramanuja's most favorite verse, and then Kuttavalakeriya Kottakal Kattalmel, that very famous verse where it centers on Nappinne, right?
Yeah.
The interpreters say that Krishna is like, don't address me first. You have to first address Shri, that is Nappinai.
Yeah.
And of course, in the same thing happens with, I mean, this is where the theology develops. You see, not verses specifically to Shri, but in the corpus, but Shri is very important, right? So you will see in the Thiruvaimuri at very critical moments, like in the sixth decade, the sixth final decade, this which is supposed to be the very famous Prapatti decade on Tirupati and Tirumala, where the feet of Vishnu are mentioned in every single verse of that decade. And the critical verse where the actual Prapatti happens, Shri is mentioned. Right, so this is seen and the same thing happens in the final decade of the Thiruvaimuri, where he mentions that Shri is present there. So there is definitely, and this is why it's the SriVaishnava tradition, Shri's critical role there. So there's nothing specific to Shri, like verses that comes later in the later tradition, but not really in the Azhwars. But again, I want to sort of even when you see Tirumangai Azhwar or even Nammalvar, there are so many verses where they are speaking in their own, or what we think of as their own voice.
Sure.
And it's this voice of longing, right? So it's this idea that only the voice of longing is the voice of a woman is a later formulation. But when you read the text on their own, you see there's so many verses in which they are longing for the God, and they're speaking in their own, or there is no persona there, or no female persona. They're speaking in their own voice. And so I think, that also raises the question as to this idea that, you read Azhwar poetry autobiographically, right?
Yeah.
So what is happening in the poem really happened to the Azhwar. Now, that is obviously one of the reasons we read it that way, is because of what Bhakti does, the literary genre does, where it breaks down this barrier, this porous barrier. The frame, as I said, becomes really unstable at the very beginning of our interview, right?
Yeah.
I said that the frame becomes unstable, and you as the speaker, as the audience, can enter into the poem. And the relationship between the speaker of the poem and the poet also becomes very porous. So the speaker of the poem is equated to the poet, which is something that didn't used to happen in the earlier poetry, except
and
in
then
some
you step into the place of the poet. So it's like this merging of everything into one.
Exactly, like parallel mirrors. But at the same time, so that's Bhakti poetry allows you to do that. So this is why we read them as autobiographical. So whatever happens in the Natya Tirumuri happened to Andal, like it's a historical fact, right? That's why we read it, because the poetry forces us to do that. But we also have to remember the poet is also creating a persona within the poem. And we know this because of the Phalashruti verses that always conclude them, the 11th verse, where the poet will speak of themselves in the third person, right? And they will say, this person spoke about what? So the poet is therefore clearly aware of themselves as both the speaker and the poet. There's a kind of poetic persona at play in that, functioning in that Phalashruti verse, where they're saying
the matrix.
Exactly, for the Phalashruti verse, where there's this kind of tension, where the Phalashruti will say, oh, they spoke about being really separated from Krishna, but recite this verse and then you will have like lots of noble children. Or you recite, they sang in this way that they're separated from Krishna, but you recite this and you will definitely reach Vaikuntha. So there's a kind of, Maran sang these verses, right? So there's this kind of tension there that exists in the Phalashruti, which are spoken in the third person. This is where we get all the historical information, right? The name of the poet, what town they came from, whether they were related to some king or not. All of the historical information comes from these Phalashruti. So they're very, very key verses to us. But they also have a very unusual relationship to the verses that preceded, because they are both sort of the period, the full stop at the end of the verse, but they're also outside of them. They're kind of these meta poems. And they kind of indicate to us that the poet has a poetic persona, right? So, which makes us have to be, as readers, very careful. Parse what is the speaker's voice, what is the persona, what is the poetic voice, and understand that the poet is playing with us.
But Professor Venkatesan, I want to zoom out a little bit. And I was thinking to myself, so much of your work is, painstakingly going through ancient poetry, and, and often guessing the poet's intention. But do you think that there are any contemporary Azhwars who are alive today, or saint-like figures or poets? And if so, who do you think these people might be? And wouldn't it be easier to study people alive because then you just talk to them?
No, definitely not. At least for me, I think that's the excitement, to try to figure it out on your own. What's the point of meeting somebody and asking them, this is what it is. The meaning is, this is what it is. I mean, it closes off the possibility, right? It closes off the possibilities of interpretation. For me, poetry is so powerful because it's infinitely meaningful, infinitely meaning making.
Yeah, you can read into it the meaning you want, right?
No, I don't say that it's no.
Yeah. Sorry, I misspoke. That's not what you meant.
You cannot read into it whatever you want, because there are rules. You can't read Andal and say it's about the NBA final.
She's a Lakers fan. She's a Lakers fan.
Right. You can't. There are certain rules about.
She says she likes the dark one. That's LeBron.
Exactly. Right. So there are certain, limitations. So it's not this idea like any interpretation goes and you as a reader, but poetry is like, it's like a really intense sort of, like a very dense, very impacted sort of bomb, if you will, right? A linguistic bomb. And like a bomb of fragrance. And but it's endlessly renewable, right? It's not like you just burst this like bath bomb and it's over. It's like you burst it and then it comes back together, and then you burst it again. And each time you do it, it gives you a different sort of experience. It gives you a different sort of entry. And one of the wonderful things about these poems is that it allows you to enter them from different places, right? So you can read the Nachiyar Tirumuri from Nachiyar Tirumuri 1 to 14 and you'll get one set of meanings. But say you decide you want to read Nachiyar Tirumuri by only reading the verses that are messenger poems. Gives you a different kind of meaning. Okay, I want to get rid of all of the messenger poems. I want to read only the Gopi verses. Gives you a completely different meaning. What if you I want to rearrange the poem completely. I want to put Varanamayiram at the end. And I want to group all the messenger poems together. Gives you a different possibility, right? So there's a kind of power to you. The poet is like the greatest gift giver there is, because they give you this gift and it's like a puzzle, and you as the reader get to put this puzzle together over and over again, and accept every time you put it together, the possibilities of how that puzzle are going to work and come together are literally infinite.
That's exactly how I feel about ragas.
It is like that. I mean, that is I think, a very key aspect of how you read Indian poetry. Is that it's what the great writer A.K. Ramanujan called radial reading. You don't read in a linear way, but you read in this very elusive way that is kind of like it's one X goes to Y, goes to Z. It's sort of like a skipping stone, right? So, and it's endless, and it's sort of looping, and it's circular. And like in the Thiruvaimuri, you can sort of read only the verses on the various kshetras. You get one kind of poem. Read only the 270 verses that are in the female voice. You get a different kind of poem. You decide, you know what, I only want to read those verses. I want to just trace, as Frank Clooney has done, the word Nediyai, the tall one, the towering one. This very vague, very abstract word. What does Nediyai or Nedumal mean, really? The towering God. I just want to use it, just trace it all the ways it occurs in the Thiruvaimuri. The possibilities are endless. So, so it's a kind of, so I would say that for us as readers, the challenge for us as readers is both to be respectful of the tradition that has nurtured these poems, and that they've survived because of all of the acharyas and commentators who have written commentaries and sought to preserve this tradition in all of these different ways. But to be bound by them and to say that they have the last word. In fact, that is why Ramanuja himself never wrote a commentary on the Thiruvaimuri, because he said that if I wrote a commentary, that will be the last word. Nobody will write a commentary on the Thiruvaimuri after me. So he himself, the great Ramanuja himself, recognized the importance of leaving a text like the Thiruvaimuri or the Tirupavai or the Periya Tirumuri or any of these great works open, so that each of us can enter them and re-enter them, make them our own. And one of the things I always say is poetry makes worlds.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Right? You make it, he's given us the gift of having a personal experience without any dogma behind it. You experience it for yourself. It's beautiful, Professor.
Right. So poetry is a world-making exercise, right? You read poetry and it makes a kind of world. But it also unmakes the world, right? You finish the poem, it's over. But then you get to rebuild the world. And every time, so it's up to us to think about the kinds of worlds we want to create through this kind of regenerative process, because the capaciousness of the poems gives us that opportunity, right? So that for me has always been very important sort of as a reader of the Azhwars, trying to understand and walking that very narrow line and that kind of tightrope, if you will, between respect and sort of regard for the great Sampradaya that has nurtured the Divya Prabandam, but also for me reading them as poems, as just like great poetry. And what does it, I mean, there were days that I would just read a single verse of the Thiruvaimuri and I would just be crying because I was like, it's so beautiful, right? It's just, it's so, I would just be like astounded by just the capacity of a poet to put so much, pack so much into so few words. Like that verse that I just said, the Vidamin Mutravam, Vida Seidum, it's only couplet. I just sat there like, how do you, you know, how do you do it in just 2 lines with a repetition of a single word over and over again?
And how do you capture that emotion of letting go of everything except the guy who you know, it's just, I mean, it's beautiful. It's beyond beautiful, right? Even thinking about it makes me a little emotional. It just wow, right?
Man, beautiful.
I mean, to not change track, but just, did you think that these Azhwars understood where they stood in this lineage and somehow, or were they? I mean, it's such a weird question, right? Because it was such a short-term timeline from 6th century to Ramanuja's time, 11th century, right? You know, where they're already codified into basically Ubaya Vedanta, right? These are suddenly these people within 300 years become considered equal to the Vedas. But there must have been some of that happening during that timeline where they were already there, right? And did they understand that at all? I mean,
I don't know. That's a question. I think it's hard to say, right? Yeah. Because we don't have that much external to them, right? We don't have like a whole lot of, we don't know anything. Like we don't have inscriptions, you know, we don't have, we don't have, not from that period that tells us about Tirumangai Alvar, except for this one thing about, you know, the Parameshwara Vinnagar. We don't really have like people telling us about, you know, other people telling us about the Alvars, right? Except Madhura Kavi's Kannin Chiritamba, which is about Nammalvar. But even in that, he doesn't tell us anything about Nammalvar. Instead, he tells us about his relationship to Nammalvar. So you don't have within that 6 through 9, and of course you have Kodai talking about Vishnu Chittan, right? So you have those kinds of references, but those are, again, what does she tell us? So she just tells us he is the Buttar Piran of Puduvai. What does that, I mean, and of course that stands in contrast to the to what the hagiographies tell us, that he was a very humble garland maker. Yeah. But in the poetry, is like he's the king of Puduvai. You know, he's the Piran, he's the, you know, he's the king, cone, butter, he's a butter cone, he's like the king of all the butters, you know, it's like, so there's a kind of, so we don't really have external information. Were they aware of each other? I think they must have been, but you know, again, it's all very hypothetical.
How did this get compiled into a single, like, corpus, right? It could have totally been like Andal would have never been, Kodai would have never been included, Vishnu Chitta would have been never included. It would only have been Nammalvar. But how did this become one poetic work?
We don't know. And I mean, that again, we don't really have a kind of clear sense of how that happens, right? Whether it is, we only have these kind of hagiography, these narratives. We have sort of early records of the recitation of the Thiruvaimuri. So we know that the Thiruvaimuri, what we do know is that from a very early period, from the very formative period of the SriVaishnava tradition.
Yeah, with Yamunacharya.
The Tirupave and the Thiruvaimuri are both very important because we see them attested to in inscription, that the recitation of those texts is very early. But we don't know much about we don't know anything else. Like, how do these texts get incorporated? How did the Nachar Tirumuri get included? Because it's, as I said, quite a radical work. What was the process of compilation? We only have this kind of, is it an anthology? Is it a compilation? Why are some of the verses incomplete? The Tiruvasariyam, even of Nammalvar himself, Tiruvasariyam and Periya Tiruvannadi are almost certainly incomplete works. So there's a lot we don't know. And so there needs to be more research done on actually the whole sort of the coming together of the Divya Prabandam itself. And that's one of the things I always sort of lament, is that there are lots of people working on the SriVaishnava Sampradaya tradition, but most of them work on the Sanskrit side.
Yeah, that's right.
And the philosophical side. As
opposed to poetry, you mean? As opposed to the poetic side?
As opposed to the Tamil side,
on
the Azhwar side.
Got it.
Very little being done really on the Azhwars. And so I think I will hope that people will, that's one of the reasons I want to translate these works as a way to, because big barrier is that a lot of the Divya Prabandam hasn't been translated in an accessible manner. I know that there's several translations available on the internet, but they're not accessible, they're not readable, they don't quite convey the poetry, the power of the text. So I think that's one of the big hurdles, unlike the Shaiva canon, which has a very long history, right? For a very long
translation. One of the ones I used before was this one. I'm sure you've had that. You've seen this one. With Govindacharya, he's got the holy lives of Alvars and their message, and basically, but it's very difficult to read in a certain way as poetry. It doesn't come off as poetry. But in this regard, I have some people have asked me questions to ask you. Krishna, do you have any questions you want to go through first?
No, I'll let you go first.
Okay.
You're probably going to cover the same ones. I already got it out. Yeah.
So the question that some people ask is, so in Andal Sthirupave, the first Pasuram kind of covers both the time, the month and the place, but doesn't cover like the year. Is there any significance of that, or is that just is that not something that people thought about?
The year meaning like when the year like 742 that she composed?
No, not exactly that, but like like when she talks about the month and whatever, maybe
like she like in this is like a
in reference to a king or like
why doesn't she say? I think so here's where it's a good question, and I think this is where we read the Tirupave as though it were a vow, that the Pave Numbu that Kodai herself observed, but it's very clear that is not the case, because in the Phalashruti, the 30th Vangakadal, she says very clearly this is a song about the Gopi girls observing a vow. So what I think is happening here is that she is describing a generic vow that takes place, that is adapted from the Sangam corpus, that was a Margari vow taken to the goddess Katyayani. So she's taking that and adapting it to the Krishna, so Ayar party. So it is not meant to be specific, right? Because it's meant to be replicated Margari after Margari after Margari. So it's not like a specific in the Varshatla Mattunna Parnada, right? So it begins by saying Margari Tingal Madinira in the Nannalal. But she also begins Natyar Tirumuri by saying Tayyur Tingalum, right? In the full moons of Thai. So I think the purpose, the success of the Tirupave is because it uses that first person plural so effectively, so that you are invited into the vow. So you become a person undertaking this vow. And it's also this, of course, Manikavachakar himself writes the Tiruvembavai as well. So it's a kind of genre of vow poetry, which ends with this refrain, Elor Empavai.
Yeah.
And so it's meant to be a vow that you observe, that anybody can observe. So that's why I think it's not specific to, there's no specific historical information as to a king or a specific year or whatever.
Sure. Another question people were asking me is, what influence does Kodai or Andal have on other female saints in the preceding generations or time period?
I don't know. We don't know. Again, we don't know how much the poetry traveled. Like we know that the Azhwar poetry more broadly kind of traveled. Whether we don't know whether we know Tirupavai, Manikavachakar composes the Tiruvembavai.
Okay.
So probably in response to the Tirupavai. But we don't know, there's a one-to-one correspondence, like Gita Govinda, for instance, was influenced by somehow the Tirupavai and Nachar Tirumuri getting to Odisha or not. So it's very difficult to say precisely how Kodai Andal herself as a poet influenced.
So I guess that follows. The next question is, how someone asked, how early was the Tirupavai introduced to non-Tamil regions in South India? Do we know that?
Tirupavai non-Tamil regions, probably I would guess quite late.
Yeah.
Yes. There is in Banaras a Karthik vow that's similar. But it's not, again, like you see it being, once the Adhyayanotsavam once it's being incorporated, then you see that from very early period, it's being recited, like in Tirumala and other temples in Telugu speaking areas. Now, but whether you're talking about it going up like to Vrindavan or something like that, we don't have any, so far, there's nobody we have not found anything, like a Hindi translation of the Tirupavai from the 14th century or something like that.
But we do find during the Vijayanagara Empire, there was wasn't there a autobiography done by
yes.
Krishna
So there's a story so there's two different things, right? So if you're asking about Andal's sort of, she begins to boom like after the 12th century. There's a kind of Andal boom where the temples and her shrines start to show up and all of that. That's very clear. Yeah. And it booms even more in the Vijayanagara period, where you have Krishna Devaraya composed this very important text in Telugu called the Amuktamanyada.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about the texts themselves, the Tirupavai and the Nachar Tirumuri, that we, as texts sort of traveling, it's difficult to say. We don't really have translations, and we don't really have, at least not that I know of, and if somebody knows, I'd be happy to learn of them. But there's a very interesting inscription at the SriVillaiputtur Andal temple, which incorporates lines from it's a 15th century inscription, which incorporates lines from the Nachar Tirumuri, and is written as a love letter to Ranganatha. Using the lines from the Nachar Tirumuri. So that's a very unusual, a very interesting kind of inscription.
That is fascinating.
On the main Vimana of the SriVillaiputtur Andal temple. So there's those kinds of things, but there's a kind of Andal boom that takes place in terms of like hagiographies, in terms of Tanyans being composed to her, in terms of starting in the 12th century, and by the 15th century, it's just like all over the place. You see the temple itself come up, the SriVillaiputtur temple come up, and then there's there's the Amuktamanyada is composed like prior to that. Then you have like the Divya Suricharitam, which is another hagiography that's composed, and then it just kind of snowballs.
Is there any reason why the Tirupavai is probably more well known than her Nachar Tirumuri?
Probably because it's a communal work. It's not it's not like the Nachar Tirumuri is about, it's a single voice. It's mostly a single voice. I think it's also it's also a kind of communal vow. So it's something that you could observe, right? Observe a vow. But I also think that the Nachar Tirumuri is a very erotic text. It's a very sexy poem. It's a tough work, and it also really pushes some boundaries, as I said. Like in the 13th section of the Nachar Tirumuri, she sort of talks about her desire growing so great that she wants to rip out her breasts, clearly invoking the Silapadigaram. So that kind of, you don't see that kind of emotional sort of fever pitch in any of the other poets. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons that the poem is there but not there, right? But what's interesting, I sort of want to slightly push back on this idea is the popularity of the Nachiyar Tirumuri and the Tirupavai. Yes, the Tirupavai is certainly more well known, but throughout the tradition, the Nachiyar Tirumuri is not sort of sidelined. It's constantly used, like it even more than the Tirupavai. It's in the Nachiyar Tirumuris that is what textures the stories of Andal. They quote very frequently from the Nachiyar Tirumuri in creating the hagiographies. They quote lines from the Nachiyar Tirumuri. Festivals that take place in the Srivilliputturu Andal temple rely much more on the Nachiyar Tirumuri than the Tirupavai. So there are ways in which the Nachiyar Tirumuri has a perhaps kind of not necessarily visible, but very persistent life.
Right.
And it's not something that has been sidelined by the tradition. It's not like, oh, we want to suppress the Nachiyar Tirumuri. It's just that it's less well known in the popular imagination, but it's definitely not a less regarded text within the SriVaishnava tradition, even though the Tirupavai is definitely, it's the second most commented text in the SriVaishnava tradition after the Tiruvayamuri.
Interesting. I guess my other question then would be like, I mean, I know we're coming almost on 2 hours now. So I want to start wrapping this up, but you know, where does this literature sit right now in Tamil Nadu, right? In the place where it was born? Does it have widespread knowledge? Is it being promulgated? Is the government doing anything to have people learn this kind of stuff, or is it just kind of just sitting in the Sri Vaishnava tradition and that tradition alone?
Sitting in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. I think it's part of like some, like Tamil classes, you'll read the Tirupavai and you read Tiruvayamuri and so forth. But no, it's very much religious literature. It's very much religious literature. And again, you will see them primarily taught in sort of Vaishnavism departments. And always taught along with the commentaries. So yeah, it's not like it's not really, but I mean, people are still, you have, Tirupavai is, I think, very unusual because it kind of has this life of its own during Margari Masam, where it's blasted, everybody listens to it, it's blasting in the loudspeakers, people are singing it in the concerts. So it kind of has a very different, I think, it's in a category of its own. But I think that the other texts definitely are very much live within the realm of the Sri Vaishnava tradition. They're very much rooted in it, which is of course very different from the Shaiva tradition, where you have the Tiruvasakam and so forth are very much outside. So it's but that is part, that's what happens when you institutionalize, and it became such a closely guarded textual tradition. It was very closely guarded, very few people had access to it, outsiders. And so that's what happens.
Professor Venkatesan, can I ask one last question? I know we're almost up to time, but I have two daughters. One is 5 years old. Her name is Lalita, and one who's younger, Meenakshi, who's 2. And if they ask me about Andal, like, what are some lessons I can tell young children about Andal that you think they would resonate? I know you speak to university students and grad students all the time, professors. But if my kids ask me, Papa, tell me about Andal, like, what are some points you think I can give them? Is that okay? Fair question?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a wonderful question, actually.
She loves nature, I know that, right? She has a parrot just like Meenakshi too, right? Which is very fascinating.
She has a parrot.
I think I saw a video on YouTube where you were talking to another professor or someone, how there's a temple where Meenakshi and Andal are facing each other, in fact, right? I forget where that was. Madurai, maybe? I don't know.
They're not facing each other. No,
not facing each other.
Yeah, no, but they're mirrors of each other.
Oh.
And that's because of Tirumalai Nayakar, and that's a whole other rabbit hole. But they both have the Margari Neerat Utsavam. Anyway, that's like a
Yeah.
whole other conversation. But what would I tell a young
Andal,
girl,
or even young boys, Andal for children, children,
first, I think the fact that she is a woman writing poetry, I think is remarkable. Is something worth pointing out. I think that that the fact that she uses poetry to sort of express very deep, private feeling, that she's able to, but she does it in ways that are playful sometimes, but also quite sort of very close to the bone.
Oh, yeah.
She's somebody who's very observant, of her natural world, very aware of her body, and her relationship to. She's a profound empathy. She has a profound empathy for I think the world. But she also feels, at least the voice in the poems, she's also feels very alone. And I think this is one of
separateness
the things,
again, yeah.
One of the things I think that is very moving to me reading Andal is that how I hear that, as I remember being a young woman, feeling isolated, feeling like nobody understood me, I was suffering everything just by myself, and there was nobody out there who could hear what I was saying. Nobody could feel what I was feeling. But yet I felt what everybody else was feeling, right? There's this, and that's a very, I think, very human thing, but she has a wonderfully honest way about describing that very fundamental human experience of isolation. That is, but at the same time, building it towards a particular kind of, very deep and profound empathy. And I think that's where her poetry comes, it's so resonant for so many of us, is because she's able to speak to our darkest fears and our most vivid yearnings, right? What we like really yearn for and cannot express, she finds a way to express them. So I would say to a young woman that, because often women are told not to express themselves, not to say what you feel, keep it inside.
Or boys too, by the way.
But the idea of modesty, it's build it
right.
and speak.
Don't be too emotional, right? Don't get
be
too
emotional. Don't be hysterical.
This is true.
Be modest. Be quiet. The fact that she throws that all out of the window, that she chooses honesty. She doesn't sugarcoat anything. She doesn't sugarcoat what suffering is like, or what the pangs of desire are like. I think is a very liberating thing, I think, for a lot of women to read.
That was a beautiful response. That was amazing, Professor Venkatesan. What a way, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being so articulate. You just hit upon the points, and I'm going to tell my daughter those things, okay? I wrote them all down. I'm going to watch the video again and make sure I got it right. But I look forward to getting more knowledge from you. And what are your next projects? What are you doing next?
What am I doing next? I'm working on this translation. I'm sort of the series editor of this translation for the Kambaramayana, where 7 people translating the 6 books of the Kamban. I'm doing Sundarakandam.
Wow, that's a huge one.
Yeah, for sure.
It's wonderful. It's been a bit of a challenge.
Contain
I'm not quite there. I'm very early stages, but it's been a challenge because doing narrative poetry is and of course the ornateness of Kanban is I'm learning right now. I'm sort of learning how to translate Kamban.
Well, we'll definitely purchase whatever you pre-order this book that you're going to do.
Yes, well, it'll be like at the rate I go, looks like another 10 years.
Sounds good. We can wait patiently, like I'm Andal.
Yeah, but the other project that I'm working on, I'm hoping to bring it to fruition soon, is this project I've been working on for, I think, since 2000 and well, it started when I did my Andal work in the SriVaishnava temple, but really started off in 2005, is a project on the Adhyayanotsavam, which is the festival of recitation of the Nachar, or of the Divya Prabandam.
Hmm.
So I've been really interested in this festival, and I'm working on the Navatirupadi project. I'm working on it in the Navatirupadi's and Nanganeri and Tirukurungudi. So that's something that I'm hoping to bring to conclusion in the next few years. I still have to do. I was supposed to go. Obviously, I go every Margari
Yeah.
for the Dinotsvam, but wasn't able to go this year
Sure.
because I can only do one temple every year. So I still have to do Azhwar Tirunagari. I've done some of it, but I have to still finish Azhwar Tirunagari. So I'm hoping that all things being safe in 21 Margari, I'll be able to go.
Good luck. You're gonna do everything. Good luck. Good luck.
And this is Krishna wants to do this final question, which is usually the question now. It's not usually, you're the first one we're going to ask. Is
I forget what I didn't remember what you're talking about. But go ahead.
This is what have you learned now that you did not know before you started any of these projects?
So much. I can't even. There's so much. I can't even begin to. I can't even begin to. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
So much about, like, as I said, the very first thing is, like, I didn't even know Andal was like a actual historical person. So
yeah,
the life of the Nachar Tirumari, because I had this received wisdom that Nachar Tirumari is not really popular. It doesn't, like, it's just this hidden thing. And then I go to SriVillaputturu and it's everywhere. And so many things, like the life of the Tiruvaimuri in Temple Festival, how people, like, feel the Tiruvaimuri, it's like the relationship of the Adhyayanotsavam, like my whole understanding of the Adhyayanotsavam, my interest in that festival, I'd just say that I'm fundamentally changed as a scholar, as a person, working with these texts. Makes you reflect very deeply on who you are as a human being, reflects very deeply on the creative process. What is it I'm doing as a translator? Why am I translating? What's the purpose of translation? What do I want to achieve as a translator? Very small things, but very big things. You learn little details. Oh, this was the first reference to the Shatari, or some little, like, nugget of when the Tiruvaimuri was first translated, or these kinds of historical details that you come up with.
Well, outside the historical stuff, is there something that you found about yourself in terms of like your relationship to Hinduism or spirituality that has come from this, or has it been a very much like a not just academic, but like a emotional thing?
Definitely emotional. I don't think you can work on these texts without it affecting you in some very profound way. So it's, as I said, it's like working on the Tiruvaimuri changed me completely, utterly. You cannot not, it's a very great work. And I think this is true of any great work, and I suspect it will be the same when I'm done with the Kamban, right? When you live with a text for a very long time, and when you sort of get into the skin of it, you're sort of almost like living inside of it, you're breathing inside of it.
Right.
You inhabit it in some very way, and it's inhabiting you. You are utterly changed by that.
Yeah, and Professor Venkatesan, I'm also so inspired that you're not just sitting down, armchair historian style, reading books in the corner. You're actually going to these places and seeing the festivals and seeing the temples. And appreciating the architecture. So your approach is also so hands-on and with the people, with the practice. It's not just an academic. So I really respect that a lot. Yeah, you're actually going to these places. I wish that you have safe travels in 2021 so you can go see all the places.
I hope so too. It was the first Margary in I think 12 years, 14 years that I wasn't in India. So
it'll happen again. It'll happen again.
So, but yeah, so it's a very difficult question for me to answer, Mukunda.
Next podcast, next time, next interview.
I can't give you a more sort of like
no, I mean there's no right or wrong answer. Like
you've done a great job. Are you kidding me?
No,
it's just all I can say is that it's a profoundly moving, emotional, and transformative experience. There's no question about it.
Thank you for sharing.
Who I was at the start of doing the Tiruvamuri is certainly not who I was at the end of it. So,
well, that's fantastic. Do you have any last? Not last thoughts. I always have to say last thoughts, but I don't mean last thoughts, obviously.
Yeah.
But do you have any thoughts that you want to close off on that you think that we did not miss, or that you think that is so important for people to know about this literature, or
a link or a website for audience to check out or something?
Well, I have a website. You can. I haven't updated it for a while, but if you want to, I've got some more translations like Samtramangai and stuff. It's the website is archana.faculty.ucdavis.edu.
We'll put that in the description.
The link.
I'll put that, and I'll put the Amazon links to your books.
Yeah, so you can put, and it's got some stuff on the Adhyanotsavam and some photos and stuff. But we've covered a lot of ground, and the only thing I would just encourage people is to, even if you don't know Tamil, just read this work. Just find a way. And those of you who are like me, didn't know Tamil, didn't know anything about Sangam literature, start. Just start, and you can learn it. It's not difficult. And you can learn it, and I hope that there will be people. There are lots and lots of engineers. I'm very glad for all the scientists out there who found the vaccine.
That's right.
But the reason that we live and we have a vaccine, and that is so that we can enjoy and relish this wondrous world in which we live. And for that, humanists. And you need poets, and you need artists. So those of you out there listening, there's like 20 computer science programmers for one poet. So you be that one poet.
I love it.
I love it. That's fantastic.
Great way to. Thank you, Doctor.
Pavana Munijana Yamuna Tire Pavana Munijana Yamuna Tire Gayati Vanamali Gayati Vanamali Maduram Gayati Vanamali